Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are Irenicast. I'm Jeff.
It's your boy, Alan.
And this is Rajiv.
Thanks for joining us for our continuing conversation to provoke your progressive Christian imagination. This week, we're going to be talking about our most recent episode, which is episode 170, White Supremacy in Evangelicalism. So we're excited about that as we're kind of waiting for everyone to come on. Don't forget to say hi in the comments so that we know that you're here. We won't call you out unless you say hi, so we won't embarrass anyone. But we do want to hear from you because that's the point of this particular place, is to hear from you specifically about the episode that we just did. Again, that. But as we're getting ready to go, for those of you that are listening to this on the podcast feed, you can check the show notes for this episode at irenicast.com/170live. That's irenicast.com/170live. Live 170. Yes, live 170. And before we get started, we got some important announcement right at the beginning. Rajiv and Bonnie are going, not solo, but they're starting a brand new podcast that's going to come to you on the second Tuesday of every month.
Yep.
And it's called Haystack. So if you have a friend, I'm not going to say anything. Rajiv, tell us about Haystack.
So Haystacks is a podcast designed specifically for fringe or former or ex Seventh-day Adventists. And we're going to do it once a month to start off, second Tuesday of the month. So that's tomorrow. But those of you that are tuned in, it's already up. We're not going to be pushing it out till the morning, but we're on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. And you can always go to the website, haystackspodcast.com, and listen from there, download, share it with people. And the term haystacks is very much an insider Seventh-day Adventist term. It's a way of building a taco salad that even those of us that have left forever ago, it's still one of the favorite meals. They're the best.
All right, so make sure everyone checks that out. We'll put that in the show notes for this episode. It'll be on our website. It'll be all over the place. You'll be hearing about it over the next few weeks to kind of kickstart that. So if you are a former Seventh-day Adventist or you know someone who is, recommend go to them.
Sure, please.
I'm not a Seventh-day Adventist, but I was brought in on the world of Haystacks, that salad that you guys like. And then I have friends across the country who are former Seventh-day Adventists and current ones, and apparently everybody does it everywhere.
It's everywhere.
It's like a thing. So I feel honored to have experienced it myself.
It's a for real thing.
So definitely make sure. And I forgot to mention at the top of the show, Bonnie and Casey are on assignment this week, so they will be joining us on the next episode, which we'll talk about at the end of this conversation. So if you're joining us, please feel free to say hello. And as we're waiting for people to kind of come in and comment, do either of you two have anything you want to discuss or readdress from our episode on white supremacy last week?
Man, it was quite an episode.
Yeah,
there's a lot, and I think I'm dealing with, I'm still coming to grips with seeing whiteness for what it is. I think it's going to be a long journey for me. But that feels like the really first important step is recognizing what it is, how it functions, what its history is, and how it's both a real thing and not a real thing at the same time, something you have to address and think through. And for anyone listening, we're talking about white supremacy in more fundamentalistic or evangelical circles, and at least in my experience, and what I heard people say in the episode, I can't remember if it was Casey or Bonnie, but they said that whiteness seeks to not be named, and that was fully my experience growing up in church. Is that we didn't think of ourselves as a white church, even though we very, very much were, because whiteness was just normative or thought of as normative. So my sacred work right now is discovering what that even meant and what that means for me to be in white spaces, how it functions. And I've had experiences recently where I've gotten to kind of shift out of that to just some degree and see it from different perspectives. I went to a rally where there was a lot of white people who were there in kind of a power dynamic that was not super safe, that taught me a lot. And then I went through a course recently in my doctoral work with people who are studying oppression. And so we were studying that together, and to be able to kind of evaluate my own experience, just realizing how much I have to learn in just understanding how it operates. And that alone is a product of the invisibility of white supremacy. So that's where I'm at. So it's like thinking through right now. I also brought my Awana books, if anybody wanted to see them. I mentioned this in the episode, but we were taught when we were children. Oh, sorry, mom and dad, if you're watching this. I really appreciate all that you've done for me and everyone who is a part. I'll cover their names. Should I do that? Should I cover the names of the adults who taught me this stuff? So we were taught, right, sin. It looks like poop, and you're supposed to say no to it. Like, it's a big part of it. There's we were taught things like, you're falling off a cliff, and everybody is sinful, and everybody sins in so many different ways. It's not something I would necessarily teach children in the same way these days, but nowhere did we ever talk about racism, at any point in my upbringing. And so, in fact, the way that these memorization books were set up, indigenous cultures and folks were used as I don't know I don't know why I'm doing this right now, but I am. It was used as kind of window dressing or something. And then, we were taught patriotism in the church, and a bunch of white kids standing in front of a bunch of white founding fathers, and so the coming back to it and looking at it from the eyes I have now, a lot of people say, my church didn't have any white supremacy. And I think the most important question for folks who are experiencing that is, did they have anything that taught against it? Did you ever hear any messages against that, or that even questioned how that operates? And for a lot of us, the answer is no. We were never taught about racism, never taught about oppression historically, or how it functioned now. So that's something I'm wrestling through.
I would say Awana was appropriating Native American
Absolutely
in so many ways. Even I know that Awana is an acronym, but it's an acronym that sounds a little bit like they wanted it to sound like it was some sort of Native American term. Maybe that's speculation, but that's how I was in Awana briefly before I went to a different denomination. And I remember one of the leaders using the word Awana in a, like he was going to a Redskins game or something, you know what I mean? Really chanting that and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's,
at the very least, it's a little misogynistic, right? Approved workmen are not ashamed.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm still in the phase of identifying how white supremacy was operative for me. And I heard myself talking on that episode, and it's I think there's some folks who are just looking for evidence because they were raised in it so much that to even perceive it as a fish in water or something like that.
Rajiv, how about you? Any musings about our recent episode?
Yeah. I mean, it was a good conversation. It's a tough one to have. And like you pointed out, Alan, it is, it's one of those things that, the closest parallel that I have is maleness and heteronormativity, and gender expression is, you just walk around thinking that's the way it's supposed to be. And until you take the time to notice it and examine it, it's just, in your mind, it's the way it's supposed to be. But the fact that people walk around and are just willing to continue walking around that way is really frustrating and downright, angering. in a lot of ways. And I say that in a multiple formats. So there's the race thing, there's gender thing, maleness, privilege in various ways. It's a real problem. Life is good if it's good for you.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. For those of you that are coming in, don't forget to say hi in the comments or give your thoughts on this particular episode or anything that we're saying right now. I do want to draw attention to when we posted this episode on Facebook, we did have a comment from one of our listeners, Nancy White. And she said, and I thought there's some interesting stuff here that might be something we can discuss as well. But she said, while listening, it struck me that lately the evangelical church has spent so much time preaching against other, quote, sins, homosexuality, abortion. And then she put in, parentheses, I actually can't think of another overarching one at the moment. That they've glossed over the sin of partiality from James 2 and naming racism specifically. Maybe that's the result of wanting to conserve whiteness, or maybe it's following the narrative handed down for generations without thinking through it. I think that's a really interesting point bringing up. Richard, thank you for Rajiv.
Thanks, Richard. You're my favorite.
Lisa, welcome. Welcome to the conversation.
Hey, Lisa.
My favorite. Let's not fight over Richard. He's the best.
Richard loves me the most.
Or maybe I'll just say I'm his favorite.
But I think that's an interesting correlation between James 2. So if you're listening and you're not familiar, James 2, they're talking about how if there's someone, in evangelicalism, I remember this used a lot, but if someone comes into the church and they're, destitute or whatever, are you going to treat them the same? Or are you going to, reserve the spot for the people that are, wealthier in the church? And that idea of partiality, specifically in that verse or in that section of scripture, talking specifically about wealth. But I think that's an interesting, the idea of partiality that a lot of white evangelicals don't see. Anyway, I'm what do you guys think? I'm gonna stop rambling.
Yeah, I don't think it's as unknowing as we like to make it come across. It's pretty deliberate and it's pretty sinister. It's just if you're part of it, some degree of you, and again, I can correlate this to maleness as well. Some part of you is kind of glad you're there because it's easier for you than it is for other people. And you're not sure you entirely want to lose all that. You just want it to be better for other people too. And whether that can happen or not is certainly a question lots of people wrestle with. But to push a show here, but it's on, I think it's on Hulu, Mrs. America. It chronicles, it's pretty good historical docudrama. It chronicles the ERA amendment, Equal Rights Amendment. And the calculation of the right wing, the moral majority, like in this, they talk about Jerry Falwell a little bit. He's kind of like a nobody. He needs Phyllis Schlafly and others to become somebody. So this was all pretty calculated and done by design to focus on those kinds of hot button issues that would then push aside everything else that was justice focused or decency minded. And, just because you're not aware that people are behind the scenes pulling the strings, if you're an adult, there comes an age of accountability where you got to know some shit before you start mouthing off.
I understand what you're saying. I think there is a part of evangelicals and a part of a lot of white people who are experiencing privilege, and they know they are. There is that really deep part of them that knows this, but I still think that the illusions are really powerful that things are just fair. If the system and the structure itself is already oppressive, when I hear things don't show partiality, I hear that weaponized in the evangelical church. The whole refusal to admit that the structure itself is racist, that our country was founded on racism, and that a lot of our religions operated on that. So I know a lot of people who feel like, things are fair. They're just fair. And there's a denial that systemic racism is real, at least in, the evangelical world. I think that was to a large degree, at least in white churches, the case. So I don't know how much of people, our own selves really recognize that, or I know what you're saying, Rajiv, but like it still is insidious for a lot of folks, and probably not so much now, right? Because of the conversations that are happening around the country inside of evangelical churches. I don't know if you've seen some of those lately, but they're happening conference wide. They're happening at big denominational events, and I guess they've always sort of happened. But
yeah, but at what point do you think to yourself, or should one think to themselves, why are things the way they are? Why does that group of people across town, not have running water or clean drinking water? I mean, that's it takes work. It's like I remember as a classroom teacher, I was like, it takes work to get an F. You've got to really try hard to do nothing. Even if you turn in the basic stuff, you don't even have to try very much. You can get a D. You can, pass minimally. So I don't know. There comes an age where you've got to look up, and I think a lot of people do. But the temptation is, I've got it easier than XYZ, and I kind of want to keep it that way. I honestly think that's where most people are when it comes to, various levels of privilege.
The other part of that comment that I find really helpful is like, yeah, this wasn't a discussion that evangelical churches were having ever. That we talked about other issues as if they were the defining moment of the day, whereas this was something that was completely silent.
But why is that? That's the thing. It's like,
right.
why not this particular thing? Because if you asked any evangelical, they would say racism is a big deal. They may think that it was solved with Martin Luther King Jr. or whatever, but why wasn't it included in that? And part of that is because it wasn't there. There's, like you were saying, there's that idea of fairness. But what does that even mean? Like they think the world is fair, but what does that mean? Because then these are the same people that are saying it's not fair, not all of them, but within the realm of the ideology of evangelicalism, that their rights are being taken away because they can't sing at church, or like now things aren't fair,
right,
due to the current pandemic. So I think it's more of an indictment of the culture of evangelicalism, that it's not even something that's considered that big of a deal, because it can't. And the reason that it's not called out or looked at a little bit more, I think, is because it's associated with a political ideology that is not their own, that they've already demonized in all other areas. So if you give quote unquote Satan a foothold, then you're going to allow all that left ideology to come into evangelicalism. So I think it's a willful ignorance from leadership within evangelicalism that has allowed it to stick around.
So I've heard an interesting hypothesis saying exactly what you're saying. Before I say it, I just wanted to invite folks who are listening and our listeners to share their experiences of white supremacy in their backgrounds and in their religious contexts. Like, did you hear about it? How did you experience it? So feel free to leave a comment. But I've heard the theory that evangelicals lost the cultural war against instituting racism in law and enshrining it in law, because you think about the fights against civil rights that were headed by huge evangelical leaders in churches who fought, integration, who were pro segregation, and they did it publicly, and they used theology to back it up. And then once they lost that battle in the public square, they just shifted. They shifted to other issues. They shifted to family, or they shifted to reproductive rights or something. And then that became culturally palatable for them to have that be their central focus. Whereas they didn't really have a change of heart or a change of way of doing things. They just had a different section of society that was like politically appropriate to have these huge battles for. And ultimately what it is, and in my experience, evangelicalism needs an us and them. It needs an enemy to be able to survive, because it has to be your group of people versus the world. It has to be those on the inside against those on the outside. And so the reason racism wasn't talked about, or like white supremacy wasn't talked about, is because a lot of us, we're the ones pushing for enshrining racism in law. And then we just shifted to other. So when I hear that comment saying, we heard messages about family things or about female productive rights. The reason that happened was just a historical shift, an opportunistic shift.
Yeah,
And
but each of those issues are connected to issues of race. So when they're talking about the family, what's the number one criticism that people have against the Black Lives Movement matter is that, oh, well, their fathers aren't there. They're in jail. Maybe if they worked on their family. Like those criticisms that are connected to those issues that they adopted are very much real and rooted in those racist ideologies that were there from the beginning. So I think it's just been masked. Like even if you look at Nixon's whoever it was that was helping Nixon with that, you have that quote from him. I can't remember the guy right now, but he talked about how they purposely targeted the Black community and the war on drugs for the hippies and the blacks so that they could discredit them. And then that was the real meshing of right evangelicalism happening in the 80s with Reagan, and that culminating and most of it being driven by the war on drugs and a lot of that kind of stuff. And those are directly tied to issues of race.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, you really have to work pretty hard as a white evangelical to not be aware. I mean, mega churches are really offshoots of the Southern Baptist Convention. They say they're independent, non-denominational. But you look at their stuff, it's Southern Baptist.
That's exactly how I grew up, Rajiv.
and the Southern Baptist Convention, why did they even come into being?
Right.
It was over the issue of slavery. So I mean, it's like, it's fine to recognize you were wrong, and you were part of a community that's been wrong for decades or centuries. But to try to continue to play dumb, that doesn't serve you well. It doesn't serve anybody well.
I wonder how much of that is a product of like dominionist theology, that we're supposed to dominate the earth or convert everybody to how we are, and how we are happens to be white or happens to be, slaveholder
Absolutely
culture.
Yep.
And I wonder if that's why it's connected.
Shannon comes in and says it can be so overwhelming when we start to learn about the history of our organizations. Absolutely. I mean, if our organizations and the places that we are a part of can't own it, then they're gonna repeat it in some way, shape, or form.
I mean, in a way, there's this kind of learning that happens to us sometimes. I almost equate this to sort of prophetic level experience. You think about the biblical characters. Who was it? Ezekiel. He laid down on his left side for day after day after day or something because he was just overwhelmed with stuff. Yeah, that happens. I mean, it for real happens.
Right.
And
just connected to what Alan was saying earlier, it seems embedded in some of the rhetoric. This is from Lisa. Thank you for commenting.
Mm-hmm.
If it's God's will, then he will ... God has blessed us.
Yep.
We will go and save the lost. It is very us versus them.
Yep.
And how can that not become a cultural thing? A culture,
Sure.
What I mean? Like you're not learning from other people. You're not Rajiv talked really early on, in some of our conversations about pluralism being an important ethic, at least for our theology and religion. And if that's not something you care about, it becomes a cultural battle or a cultural war.
Right.
We have someone who commented on another point that's not visible here. They commented on the video I shared of us live streaming, and they talked about growing up in Calvinism. This is Michelle. They set the stage for this: the elect and beloved of God and the other non-elect. So yes, agree with your statement. Plus, the Christian right was set up in the 60s to go against integration. The large Christian universities didn't want to integrate, something that they learned about. Yeah, we talked a bit about that in the episode.
Mm-hmm.
Private schools, private elementary schools, private high schools, and then private universities. And I think you're right, Rajiv. It takes a lot of money and effort and energy to not be informed and to be on the wrong side of that, for sure.
And when we're talking about us versus them, the them are always unseen and unknown, right? They're them because they're not amongst you. Like we talked about this a little bit in the past. I believe, Alan, it was when we talked about whiteness and evangelicalism with Joey, right? Where he mentioned how, well, why was evangelicalism starting to move quicker in terms of its acceptance of LGBTQ community as opposed to community of race? Well, because they were among them. Like they had more experience interacting with people from the LGBTQ community than they did people of other races, as far as the integration and all that kind of stuff. And I think when a them is distanced so much that you've not left space for them among you, then you're going to have a harder time.
I still find that like really tough.
Time dividing it.
Yeah, but like, so part of me wants to like not, you know, like creating space for them within you or something like that. I feel like there's, I don't know. I feel like because our institution has been so built on within this that like, I even feel like seeking places where it's more dismantled than that, you know? Like
Right.
There are churches working for inclusion that are still very white. That's just the way it is.
No, I agree with that.
I really desire spaces that are like way beyond that are beyond just seeking inclusion.
But within certain, and this has just been my experience, is that there's always like the them is always marginalized with rhetoric and language. So they're talking about like, or like in my circles, there's always like the left, or like there's this monolith of everyone who's on the other side. And if you have even an inkling of that, there's not even room for discussion, even amongst same people.
Right.
The ideology is also us versus them. That there's not even a place welcome, because it becomes an issue of, you know, slippery slope, or, you know, be careful what you talk about, you don't want to end up there, all that kind of stuff. So it's
that you're not conforming, and conformity is like a huge marker of faithfulness for more evangelically minded churches.
And a lot of that conformity is us versus them language.
Yeah. Well, I conform really well.
Thanks for that proclamation.
I obey rules really well. Like I care, you know, I'm good at that. But for those of us who weren't good at that, right, and the listeners who weren't good at that, that became painful a lot quicker. And also, you know, anyway, really interesting.
Some good thoughts. Feel free, if you're listening, to add more. I think just going back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, but Richard, thanks for chiming in. Lots of queer Pentecostal preachers, that's for sure.
I'm also really uncomfortable right now with how, even so now that our whole society is like much more focused than it's been at any other point in my lifetime, at least to my knowledge, all these evangelical like inklings are coming out of, oh, we're going to solve racism the evangelical way, you know, like Jesus is the answer to racism. And it's like, well, there was someone, I forgot who he was, but he was like, look, some of y'all have Jesus and you're still racist. So tell me how your Jesus is the answer to racism, you know? Like that's
right.
Well, yeah, you know,
that's part of the problem, right? Like, okay, once a certain portion of evangelical gets it, then they're going to want to be the main person to solve it, and they're going to push out the people that are doing the work the whole time. And there's that whole part of the pendulum swing that we're seeing in bits and pieces. I think I saw something today about Bethel doing some sort of like.
I can't speak to that because I live in the town now.
I don't know the specifics, but I'll put a story in the show notes for this if I can find it before this gets onto our podcast feed.
Yes. So from what I can tell, man, I want to be careful the way I speak about other people. It's one thing to talk about my past. It's another to talk to other people in town. But basically, from what I understand, there have been some Black Lives Matter protests and rallies or efforts that have been turned into more worship events, you know, by Christians who come in and they take over the whole thing and they're going to solve racism with Jesus. And what that is a profound lack of, in my mind, understanding that like it's bigger than just about you, you know, it's still making it about your institution and culture when you do that. And missionary work itself like has been very racist and still is racist to a huge degree, even for more progressively minded people. But the church can't properly handle either one. Yeah,
That's very true, Richard. That's very true.
yeah. I mean, I didn't mention this in the episode, but I thought about it later. We were asked when did we like realize, and it took me a long time just because I can't remember when the first time I realized, because I grew up with it. But do you remember that there was some documentary about people contacting uncontacted tribes, and like, first of all, the term uncontacted tribe is like contacted by who? Like that's racist in and of itself. But we used to put up like movies in the middle of church and then talk about, oh, look at these missionaries who are going there. And then you knew they were Christian when they started wearing jeans. Like, at least in my mind, as a person watching it as a kid, it was like, it was an exportation of culture as much as anything else.
Mm-hmm.
There was that movie. What was it called?
The Tip of the Spear, I think.
Yeah, The End of the Spear, something like that. Yeah,
where someone, there was people who got killed, and man. And then also, I really loved the Poisonwood Bible. It wasn't written by a Christian, Barbara Kingsolver, but it talked about a missionary family that went into Africa, and it's this novel and trying to convert people away from like their system of marriage to make it look more like the one that they're trying to import. And that to me was a beginning point of starting to think through a little bit.
Richard says, Alan, because God lives. I'm assuming you meant because God loves white people. So if we pray for you, it will get better.
Yeah.
And then Sarah says, we are the hands of God, the only ones he has.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who is it? Teresa, I think it's Teresa of Avila. God has no hands but your hands, no face
Right.
but your face, no feet but your feet.
Channeling Casey here. I think that's what he says at his
Yeah, that's actually a very popular UCC benediction.
Sorry, I'm not in the know. I've only been to one or two.
It's a good one. It's a good one for sure. It gives people that charge. There's that missionary thing. India is such an interesting nation. I mean, there's the religious stuff, but just even politically, there's an island off of the eastern coast of India that is thought to be inhabited by the indigenous people that have been there since humans have been around. They got to that island and no one goes. The Indian government was like, well, this is ours, so we should go check it out. This was some time ago. And they got there and they were out there with spears and rocks and stuff and trying to bring down the helicopters. And so they were, right away, one of the things that, Indian politics has embedded in it is sort of this respect for life as a Hindu principle in a way. It's far from perfect, but that's why cows just walk around everywhere. But they were like, well, we're going to leave these people alone. They want to be left alone. It's their right. And they have this thing from their the equivalent of their State Department. They're like, if any foreigner goes over there, we'll arrest you before you get to that land because you're not supposed to go there. It's a protected space. And if you do go there and you get in some kind of trouble, you're on your own. They're probably going to kill you. And it's like missionary after missionary. There was this guy from some mega church in the United States.
Yeah,
whatever.
Are you talking about Senegal?
No, it's not. That's a different country.
Okay. That's what I thought.
But they, and he ends up dead, as for all they know.
Yeah.
Or he gave up his life and they adopted him in. There's no way of knowing which is the scenario. But it's like the arrogance to think that you could go into a place and you have answers for people who have been in that place for hundreds of years is the most bizarre thing. I mean, what sort of psychological makeup or mental illness does it require for you to have that perspective?
Oh my gosh, Rajiv.
Lisa says, growing up in the evangelical church, the answer to anything was Jesus. But yeah, in a wider world, it's not always loving to bring our solutions. It's loving to come alongside or just listen or be supportive. I think, though, that I can say with clarity that evangelicals have a worldview of saving people, not loving them. And the two have been conflated for sure.
Right.
That's really well said, Lisa. And there is a difference.
Right.
There's a difference between loving on people and loving people.
That's the worst phrase.
That's so gross. That's so gross.
I got another comment over here. It's a little bit long, so I'll just read a few parts from Ken. He said, when the LCA became the ELCA, racial equality wasn't a plank in their platform. And then down here, by the way, the Assemblies of God was actually started by a Southern racist named Charles Fox Parham. And when people started gravitating toward the Pentecostal movement, coupled with William Seymour's A Black Man's Preaching and Oratory and being locked out of churches when it was discovered he was Black, something had to be done. Mm-hmm. And so you talked the Assemblies of God.
We mentioned it in the episode.
You mentioned that, Jeff. Mm-hmm. That has that background. It is a little overwhelming, isn't it, to hear the histories of our institutions and some of the ways that learning about how things came to be can be overwhelming.
And the thing is, this isn't like you're not trying to untangle a spy network. This shit's like there. All you got to do is peel back one layer of the onion, and this is all there. There's really no cover up here, and that's it. It's just phenomenal that we haven't somehow just stepped away and started over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got the subtlety of a reality TV show star. Like it's just there.
Thank God progressives have fixed all of that for our next episode. Right. We're talking about how progressives have solved their white supremacy addiction and racism.
I don't think that's the topic of the show, Alan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about that. Our next episode will be racism or white supremacy in progressive Christianity. So we're not just grabbing the low hanging fruit here. We're gonna go after our own as well. So
that's pretty low hanging fruit too.
Well, yeah, that's true.
It's not hard to find there either. Certainly not historically, but even presently.
Sometimes even more sinister.
Maybe. But there's that one of the buzzwords in liberal circles is multiculturalism. I think it's starting to fade a little bit, but it's still a thing. And in seminary, there was this assignment given, like, how would you work to become a multicultural church? Like, you're a pastor at XYZ church, and then what do? And I was like, I don't know. I do this to myself a lot when it comes to grades. It's like, well, I'm just going to make my point, and then the grade's going to be whatever the grade is. And my answer was like, on this paper was like a paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs long. It's just like, if you're pastoring a white church that's, wealthy with assets, but not with people, basically sell it all or give it over to a growing non-white church, and all the members just join that church. And there you've got a multicultural church.
Yes.
Because then the power is given over. The minoritized folks aren't kind of crawling in all like, thank you so much, we're, blah, blah, blah. It's actually moving into some sort of mutuality or a power shift. And it was just like, the idea went nowhere.
It's too far.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's really interesting.
They pulled the rich young ruler on you. They're like, all right, you're asking a little too much.
That's really interesting. I'd like to table that in terms of maybe the conversation that we have following the conversation is the idea of how racist is it for churches with a lot of resources but very little people to continue to hold on and hoard that.
Yes, especially in how systemic racism has worked to make those people wealthy in those churches.
Bingo.
Wealthy.
Bingo.
Yeah,
yep.
that's a piece of the consciousness for people of earnestness or faith or spirituality that needs to be really like cemented in our brains, and there's something done about it.
And the flagships for that dynamic are really in mainline Protestantism, right? in the United States, at least.
I served a church once that had like multi-million-dollar endowments, and like nobody was showing up, but it was a bastion of, you know, whiteness to a huge degree. Even with an organ, Rajiv. Even with an organ.
Let's save that, because that's
by the way, Richard said he said I won't be listening because I was saying that we fixed all of it. Yeah.
Oh, hey, Kelly joined the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, welcome, Kelly. It's in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's good. I think we got some good stuff. And unless there's any other thoughts on this particular episode, or anyone wants to chime in from the comments, we'd love to hear from you. But I mean, at this point, what more can you say about white supremacy and evangelicalism?
I think the question
there's a lot more,
well,
Jeff.
I mean,
Keep talking about it.
No. Go ahead.
We're done, right? We're done for we're figured it out. I think it'd be good to have we have a question of the week. Post it in the comments for people to answer, and maybe the question will be, you know, did you ever hear about race or racism in any of your church contexts? Maybe that's a good question to ask.
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're listening and you'd like to chime in on that, come to our Facebook page, find the comments, and answer that question that Alan posts, or you can just email it to us, and we will share it amongst ourselves and hear from you. Because again, the point of these continuing the conversations is that we really do want to hear from you. We want to extend the conversation beyond the 5 of us or the 3 of us in this particular case, and you know, come up with stuff that's super relevant. Robin, here we go. This is the question. Robin asks, how do you think racism can be fixed?
So do you think?
Do you think? I can't read, apparently. That's less of a big question.
Well, that's the follow-up, Jeff.
There we go.
Is why or why not?
Also, if you're a YouTube listener, I just want to say we love you and see you. You're my people.
Alan's got this YouTube fantasy.
I love it.
He's going to start his own blogging channel soon, so look out for that.
Wait, what? I didn't say that.
Robin, my answer to your question is yes.
Love it.
I say yes, but I don't think I'll see it, unfortunately. I hope I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so much of this stuff just boils down to the will.
Yeah.
You know, as Bell Hooks puts it, you know, the title of her book is "The Will to Change." One of her many books, one of her best. But I mean, that's what it comes down to.
This is a good time for doing it right now.
Any time is a good time for doing
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you said yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I said yes, Robin. And
I
Jeff
also
said yes, but not in his lifetime.
Actually, that's a really good point. Oh my goodness. Oh man. Like, I think people who lean on the intractability of it and just say it's a sin issue and say this is a hard issue and we will always be sinful and we'll always be dealing with it are people who are sidestepping the real ways that we can make progress. Thank you, Robin, for asking that, and thank you, Rajiv, for your answer. That's something to think about.
And Sarah too. She says it'll take time and awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yep.
Thank you, Sarah.
And then Richard asks, will it take a generation or 2? Possibly.
I mean, there's a Jewish saying. It says you're not called to finish the work, but neither are you allowed to like not do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's
you're not responsible for fixing all of it.
It's much more poetic in the actual thing. I'm butchering it.
Right. And then Robin, this is a genuine, heartfelt question, and I know that a lot of people feel this way, but she says, I'm white and I don't want to hurt anyone. I feel like there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, just real quick, at least for me, my cousin Mona on the show, who used to be on the show, and Her name's Melody. She's putting on a class if you'd like to learn more about ways that you can be involved. And then there's other episodes that we've recorded, I think, that are really helpful, that point to ways that you can help. But like, learning about those feelings of helplessness and how that's just a starting point, that's a great way to go. Because that's a good to know you're there. And that's definitely a place that other people have found themselves and moved past. And so there is hope in that. But I appreciate you sharing that. And we have a resource list, an anti-racist resource list on Irenicast that I found to be really helpful too.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I mean, Jeff, I mean, I can't remember which episode this was, but this was a while ago. You introduced a new phrase to me when it comes to the discomfort of this kind of work. You were like, sometimes you just got to show your ass. I was like,
oh yeah,
I don't think that's appropriate, Jeff. I think that's a whole different subject. But where it's like sometimes you're willing to stumble and fall and expose yourself to embarrassment, to being misunderstood, etc. And that's part of it. And I think that's really insightful. So you're kind of responding to Robin a little bit on that comment. It's, the chances of you not making a mistake are pretty much zero.
That's right.
But in order to try, and saying I'm sorry, I want to learn are easy ways to take next steps. So hopefully you've got some people that you can jump into it with and get a little messy. But any real relationship is messy. I mean, my God.
Right.
If any of you have been in a spousal married relationship for any length of time,
to the extent that you can be wrong and not make other people feel bad that you're wrong, like that's where all the magic is. Keep putting yourself out there, keep being wrong, keep growing and stretching. And when you are wrong and you feel that shame or that like woundedness, don't make it someone else's issue. Like those are your feelings, and like just know they're gonna come and move straight through them.
Yeah.
Right. And I know for me, there's that pressure of, and I think that this is part of the culture of whiteness, is that pressure of, well, it's not going to make a difference. But I don't think that we need, we're not always going to make a difference. Like some of what we're going to do is to be able to support and just listen and have that change of mindset. And sometimes that's enough. Like there'll be times for us to make a difference, but sometimes that drive to make a difference, we end up kind of getting in that mode that we talked about earlier in this conversation where we become the white savior. And now we understand and we're going to do this. So I think that posture of just listening and being humble and being willing to be corrected is a very, very important one, because people in power don't allow themselves to be corrected. And I think that's a protest to our own whiteness in a way. And then Kelly Anderson said, Holiday said, in the 1619 project is a great starting point to understand the historic systemic links. And then Shannon shares, as white people, we can listen, spread the stories, and stand up against inequalities.
And I'm a big proponent of immigration justice and detention, visitation, and asylum seeking accompaniment. And I know that this is a really complex issue, but one of the ways that white supremacy is functioning right now is people who are undocumented are treated in horribly inhumane ways in California as well as everywhere else in our country. So take a look at, I think they rebranded away from Civic. So maybe Freedom for Immigrants, but there are visitation programs all around our country. If you want to get involved in that, that's a good way to use your privilege to defend the rights of people who need to be protected.
Right. Right. Or just use your money. Like where you buy, like if you're going to buy a book on anti-racism, there are all kinds of links. And we do have one in that anti-racist resource list that we have, irenicast.com/anti-racist, where you can, all the books in there are linked to Black owned stores. And it's something that it's a list that's curated from our personal experience. So it's not like fully, comprehensive, but we do have a link to a comprehensive list. I know that's a little meta, but we have some resources there, and we encourage you to check those out.
And just a little piece on that. Don't be overwhelmed by the list.
Right.
Just pick a thing.
Right.
Just pick a thing and dive in, and then you can begin to make connections from there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, we didn't solve racism, and we This show won't, but thankful for the opportunity to be heard and to allow some of you to be heard and speak about these issues. And we will continue this conversation in a way with our episode next week, which will be white supremacy and progressive Christianity. So stay tuned for that. Make sure that you're subscribed to the show on whatever podcast platform that you prefer to listen to. If you have any questions about any of that, you can always reach out to us at podcast@irenicast.com. And if you believe in the work that we're doing here and you'd like to partner with that, you can always donate to the show and our greater work that we're doing by going to irenicast.com/PayPal. And if you can't remember all those irenicast.com/whatevers that I'm saying all the time, just go to irenicast.com and it's all there. You can just scroll through it. And if you ever have any questions, we are very accessible with those. So for this week, for this continuing the conversation, I'm Jeff.
It's your boy, Alan.
It's Rajiv.
Thanks. I just repeated myself. Thanks for continuing the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Peace.